My name is Richard. I'm husband to a beautiful wife and the lucky father of a crafty 8-year-old boy, Thomas. I work from home as a freelancer in the software field. My wife Lauren is a teacher at our local high school. Since my wife works late hours, I take care of our son during the day and help him with his homework. I enjoy nothing more than spending time with him, but it can get a bit tough when deadlines are approaching. The day Thomas introduced me to Henry and Marie, I couldn't have been happier. Thomas was a bit shy and reserved, but it seemed he'd had made his first close friends. The two of them told me they'd moved here with their parents about a month ago and lived in a house down the streets. Henry was in Thomas' class, Marie was a year younger. For the rest of the afternoon, the kids played outside in the backyard while I kept a watchful eye on them from the office window. I met Mrs. Green briefly in the early evening when she came to get her kids. It wasn't long before Lauren, being her usual social self, invited Greens over for dinner. They were a friendly, well-educated couple in their early 40s. They'd waited to have kids to focus on their respective careers. John Green was a lecturer at a university, while his wife Lisa was a department store manager at a pharmaceutical company. We got along well enough, and they shared our delight at the kids playing together. From that day onward, Thomas would often stay at the Green's house to play with Henry and Marie. John and Lisa assured me things would be alright. They had an elderly maid who'd pick the kids up after school and watched over them until they got home. It wasn't long before Thomas first told us about Doggie, the Green's family dog. From his tales it sounded like the dog was enormous, so we assumed it was a Saint Bernard or a similar breed. At the moment, Thomas said, they kept the dog in an indoor kennel because he was sick. Soon enough the conversation shifted to other topics, like school and games. During the next 3 weeks, Thomas would often talk about Doggie. He seemed to adore him and told us petting him and playing with him. At the time, my wife and I considered getting him a puppy for his birthday. There was one thing that was a bit weird though. In all the time I'd been over at the Green's house, I'd never seen a dog. Sure, Thomas had told me the dog was staying inside, but it seemed a bit odd. Well, who knows, maybe the dog was old. I mean, I didn't know a thing about dogs anyway. One day, not too long ago, my son came up to me, a worried look on his face. He rambled on about Doggie and I learned that the old chap seemed to be really ill. He didn't even get up to play with them anymore. Thomas pleaded with me to talk with the Greens about the dog and I assured him I would. I hate to admit it, but I pushed it off. It wasn't that I ignored it, but at the time deadlines were coming up and I was buried with work. Looking back, I wish I'd acted sooner. 3 days later my son came home crying. He rushed into the office and threw himself into my arms. It surprised me to see him since he was supposed to be playing at the Green's home that afternoon. Confusion turned to worry when he told me that Doggie had gotten free and had bitten him. When I saw the bloody wound on his arm, I drove him to the hospital right away. The doctor informed me that the wound was tiny and everything would be fine before he gave me a probing look. Now tell me, Mr. Marshall, where did your son get this injury? He demanded of me. My son was attacked by a neighbor's dog. What's the problem here? What the doctor said next still makes me shiver. Well, Mr. Marshall, those bite marks on your son's arm. They don't resemble those of a dog but a human adult. I stared at the man in utter confusion. What the hell are you? I started but broke up. Doggie had bitten my son. But then those bite marks. Oh dear God. We called the cops then and there. I didn't know what I was expecting, but nothing I could have imagined even came close to the reality. What they found at the Green's house that afternoon was a sheer and utter nightmare. Doggie wasn't a dog, but a young man the Greens must have kidnapped and held captive for whatever twisted reason. The young man was missing his tongue and a vocal cord, so he wasn't able to speak or make sounds at all. His hands were mutilated and utterly useless. The poor guy couldn't even stand up anymore because of the damage done to his muscles and tendons. I'm thankful I never saw what it did to his face, but I heard it barely resembled that of a human being anymore. What makes the entire thing even weirder was the dog costume. They dressed the guy up like a dog and kept him in a basement cell. When the cops came over to take my statement, it took some time to convince Thomas that he wasn't in trouble. The police said they needed some help to find out a little bit more about Doggie and why it bitten him. Of course we didn't tell him what else was going on. He told us that Marie and Henry had found Doggie by accident. The door to the basement was locked at all times. It was off limits, their parents had said. One day so, the kids had discovered a secret way to enter the basement. It was later confirmed to be a construction error. When the parents weren't home, Henry and Marie had explored their new house and made their way down there. The room Doggie was in had no light, and they kept him in what the kids thought to be an indoor kennel. The kids assumed he was down there because he was sick, and their parents tried to help the dog get better. They told Thomas their parents often did this type of thing. Thomas told us, shoveling his feet, that it was supposed to be a secret. They'd get in trouble if their parents knew they went down there. But Thomas had been worried about the dog, so he told me and Laura about it. It was stupid, he said that he wasn't allowed to talk about him. When the police asked if the elderly maid knew anything, Thomas giggled. The old woman was gullible. They'd simply tell her they were playing upstairs and waited till she was busy with the housework. After this whole ordeal, we sent him to his room, and the police told me what must have happened that day and how lucky my son had been. Thomas, Henry and Marie had snuck into the basement once more to play with Doggie. At the time, the man was suffering from a high fever and multiple infected wounds. He was delirious. He didn't react to the kids anymore, so they opened the kennel to see if he was alright. That's when the man saw his chance and went on a rampage. He first went for Thomas, who was the closest. Luckily so, he wasn't able to use his jaws anymore, only giving Thomas a shallow bite. This allowed my son to get away. Henry and Marie weren't so lucky. The girl was beaten to death and the boy was maimed beyond recognition. He remains in critical condition. In his frenzied state, the man had thrown himself against the locked basement door till it broke open. In the course, he'd severely maimed his already weak body. On the stairs, he ran into the poor old maid who must have come down because she'd heard the kids' screams. She survived with only light injuries but suffered severe head trauma. She's still unconscious at this point. The tortured man didn't get far. He suffered from a heart attack and died right there in the Greens' backyard. Mr. and Mrs. Green were arrested on the same day. I heard they were both charged with multiple offenses, including homicide. They are currently under investigation in at least 2 more missing person cases suspected to be homicides. To this day, the identity of the man that Thomas referred to as Doggie, as well as the Green's motive, remain completely unknown.